At Christmas, my brother mocked my daughter, saying, "Hey girl, you don't deserve gifts, you're adopted," and gave her a paternity test in a gift bag, humiliating her. My nephews laughed, so I stopped paying for their school, and now he's begging me for help. It was December 24th, and my house was buzzing with life. The Christmas tree lights twinkled, the radio played carols, and the smell of hot cocoa and cookies filled the air. I'd spent weeks planning this Christmas. I wanted it to be unforgettable for my daughter, Emily, who's 11 years old. She's my world. I adopted her when she was 3, after my ex-wife left me and said she didn't want kids. I found Emily in a small orphanage, and from the moment I brought her home, I knew she'd be my family. Raising her alone hasn't been easy. I work long shifts as a doctor to pay the bills, but her smile makes it all worth it. That year, I invited my younger brother, Mark, and his family. Mark is 34, 2 years younger than me, and he's always been the guy who thinks he's hilarious. He has 2 kids, Ethan, 14, and Olivia, 12, and a wife, Sarah, who barely talks. I also invited my parents, Mr. John and Mrs. Mary, who showed up early with a box of homemade donuts. Mark and his family live a few hours away, and though we don't see each other much, I've always tried to help them. Mark lost his job 2 years ago, and since then, I've covered things like their electricity, water, and even their kids' private school tuition. It's not cheap, but I did it because they're family, and I didn't want my nephew and niece to go without. The night started off calm. Emily was running around the living room in her reindeer sweater, showing off the paper stars she'd glued to the tree. Ethan and Olivia arrived glued to their phones, barely saying hi, but that's typical for teenagers. Mark and Sarah brought a bottle of soda and a half-squashed loaf of sweetbread. My parents sat on the couch, chatting with me about my job while Emily played nearby. We ate dinner, laughed a bit, and everything seemed fine. After dinner, Mark said he wanted to do something special with the gifts. He stood up from the couch with a big grin and pulled out several boxes and bags from under the tree. "This Christmas, I'm in charge of handing them out," he said, winking at me like he was about to impress everyone. First, he called Ethan and Olivia. He gave each of them a large box wrapped in shiny paper. Ethan opened his and shouted, "An Xbox Series X, with games and everything. Dad, you're the best." Olivia opened hers and pulled out a brand new PlayStation 5 with a dance game she loves. "I can't believe it." "Thanks, Dad," she said, running to hug him. They both looked thrilled, and I figured Mark had spent a lot on those gifts, but I knew it was from a loan I'd given him days earlier to buy presents for everyone, including my Emily, so I agreed and lent him the money. I didn't say anything, just smiled from my chair. Then Mark walked over to my parents. He handed them a simple bag with a small bow. My mom, Mrs. Mary, pulled out a pair of knitted scarves, one for her and one for my dad. "So you don't get cold this winter," Mark said, sounding kind. My dad, Mr. John, nodded and said, "Thanks, son. It's nice." My mom smiled and draped the scarf over her shoulders, even though it was warm in the house. Sarah didn't get anything, but she didn't seem to care. She stayed seated, staring at her phone. I kept waiting, thinking Mark would give something to me or Emily, but he kept acting like everything was planned. Finally, only Emily was left. She was sitting on the floor near the tree, her eyes sparkling with excitement, waiting for her turn. Mark pulled out a small bag with a red bow and handed it to her with that weird smile that made me uneasy. "Open it, kid," he said, glancing at Ethan and Olivia. They looked at each other and started giggling quietly. Emily, all excited, pulled out the tissue paper from the bag. I thought it'd be something sweet, like a toy or candy. But when she held up what was inside, my blood ran cold. It was a DNA test kit, one of those sold online. Emily looked at it, confused, and read aloud, "Paternity test?" She didn't understand what was going on. Then Mark let out a loud laugh and said, "Hey, kid, you don't deserve gifts. You're adopted. What are you going to do with that? You're not really part of this family." Ethan and Olivia burst out laughing. "Yeah, find out where you came from, adopted kid." Ethan yelled, pointing at her. Olivia covered her mouth, but couldn't stop laughing. Emily froze, the box trembling in her hands. Then she looked at me, her eyes filling with tears, and whispered, "Dad, what does this mean?" I felt a rage burning in my chest. I looked at Mark, who was still laughing like he'd told the world's best joke, and at Sarah, who looked down at the floor. My parents, sitting on the couch, went silent. My mom, Mrs. Mary, put a hand to her mouth, and my dad, Mr. John, furrowed his brow, but neither said a word. Emily dropped the box and ran, crying, to her room. The door slammed, echoing through the house. I stood up from the couch so fast I almost knocked it over. "What's wrong with you, Mark? Are you stupid or what?" I yelled. He shrugged, still with that dumb grin. "Calm down, Mike, don't get like that. It was a joke. The kid needs to learn not to be so sensitive." "A joke? She's an 11-year-old girl. You idiot. You humiliated her in front of everyone." My voice shook with anger. Sarah mumbled something quietly. "Mark, maybe you went too far," but he cut her off. "Please. If they can't handle a prank, that's their problem. Besides, Mike, always so protective of your little girl. We all know she's not really yours." That was it. It wasn't just what he said, but how he said it, like Emily was worth nothing. I looked at Ethan and Olivia, still laughing with their Xbox and PlayStation in hand, and thought about everything I'd done for them. The double shifts at the hospital, the times I sent money for their stuff, the school payments. Then I looked at my parents. My mom's eyes were wet, and my dad was clenching his fists, but they didn't do anything. I felt betrayed, like no one was going to stand up for us. "Get out of my house," I said, pointing at the door. Mark blinked like he didn't believe me. "What? Seriously, Mike? It's Christmas Eve. Out, all of you," I shouted louder. "I don't want to see you here again." Sarah tried to say something, but Mark grabbed her arm and started walking toward the door, muttering, "What a drama queen. You'll get over it." Ethan and Olivia followed, carrying their consoles and still giggling. My parents stood up slowly. My mom touched my shoulder and said, "Son, calm down. Don't do anything crazy." But I was so angry I just said, "Everyone leave." When the door closed, I stood there breathing hard. I went to Emily's room and found her crying on her bed, her face buried in her pillow. I sat beside her and hugged her tight. "Don't listen to them, sweetheart. You're my daughter. You'll always be my daughter. You don't need any test to know that," I said, though it was hard to speak. She hugged me tighter and, between sobs, asked, "Why are they so mean, Dad?" I didn't know how to answer. I held her until she fell asleep. That night, looking at the tree and the test kit box on the floor, I made a decision. Mark and his family didn't deserve anything from me. Not my help, not my time, not a single cent. The next morning, December 25th, I got up early. Emily was still asleep. I grabbed my phone and canceled all the payments I had for Mark: rent, electricity, water, internet, everything. I'd also stopped paying for Ethan and Olivia's school starting in January. Days passed, and I didn't hear from Mark. I figured he was enjoying the Christmas break with his kids, spending what little they had without thinking about what was coming. But on January 5th, when the bills and rent started coming due, everything fell apart for him. The landlord called, demanding payment, and since I wasn't covering anything anymore, Mark had no way to fix it. That same day, my phone rang. It was Mark, his voice panicky. "Mike, what did you do, man?" "They cut our power today, and the landlord says he'll evict us if we don't pay the rent." "Why'd you cancel everything?" "Not my problem, Mark," I said coldly. "You wanted to mock my daughter. Now deal with the consequences." "We don't have any money. Sarah and I can't pay this on our own," he yelled. "Your family. You can't leave us on the street." "Family," I repeated. "Family doesn't humiliate an 11-year-old girl for fun. Figure it out. I'm done with you." I hung up and blocked his number. I felt resolute, but it didn't take long for doubt to creep in. On January 10th, when Ethan and Olivia were supposed to return to school, I learned they weren't allowed in. The school denied them entry because the tuition wasn't paid, and I picture Mark scrambling, trying to fix it. Part of me wondered if I'd been too harsh. Did my nephew and niece deserve this because of what their dad did? And what if my parents were right about calming down? I didn't have answers. I just knew that Christmas had changed everything. Since that night of December 24th, something shifted in Emily's eyes. She spent more time in her room, sketching in an old notebook like she didn't want to talk much. I tried to cheer her up, making her favorite meals, but I knew what Mark said still hurt. And I, though I didn't admit it out loud, was carrying it too. The day before, January 10th, I got a message from my mom saying Ethan and Olivia couldn't get into school. The secretary told Mark and Sarah that without the tuition payment, the kids couldn't start the semester. I pictured the scene. Mark yelling on the phone, Sarah quiet, as always, and my nephew and niece confused, not understanding why their new consoles didn't come with a solution to this. Part of me felt satisfied, like Mark was finally tasting what it's like to have nothing. That morning, while I sipped coffee in the kitchen, my phone buzzed. It was an unknown number. I answered, thinking it might be the hospital, but it was Mark. His voice sounded broken, like he hadn't slept. "Mike, please, hear me out," he said, almost begging. "We're on the street. The landlord gave us until tomorrow to pay, or we're out. The kids don't have school. We've got no power or water. What do you want me to do?" "Not my problem, Mark," I replied, gripping my mug tightly. "You started this. You mocked Emily, and now expect me to bail you out. Not happening. I'm not asking for me," he shouted. "It's for my kids. Ethan and Olivia don't have a place to sleep if we get kicked out. Are you really going to let your nephew and niece go through this?" I went quiet for a second. I thought about those two, how they laughed at Emily, pointing at her like she was a joke. But I also thought about the times they played with her in the yard or when I bought them ice cream in the summer. I shook my head to push those memories away. "You should have thought about them before opening your mouth that night," I said. "I'm not paying for your mistakes anymore." "Mike, you're a selfish jerk," he said, his voice cracking. "Mom and Dad are worried. They say you're going too far, that you're tearing the family apart over a bad joke." That hurt. My parents. I knew they didn't agree with what I'd done, but hearing they blamed me hit hard. I hung up without saying more and tossed the phone on the table. I stared at the wall, trying to figure out what I felt. Anger, yes, but also guilt. What if Mark was right about something? What if I was punishing people who didn't deserve it? That afternoon, Emily came out of her room with a drawing in her hand. It was a cartoon of us two, sitting under the Christmas tree, smiling. She gave it to me and said, "For you, Dad, so you're not sad." I hugged her tight, and for a moment, all the noise in my head went quiet. She didn't deserve what happened, and that reminded me why I'd cut Mark off. But the peace didn't last long. The next day, January 12th, someone knocked on the door. It was my mom, Mrs. Mary, with a plastic bag full of fresh-baked rolls. She walked in without waiting for an invite, like she always does, and sat in the living room. "Son, we need to talk," she said, with that tone she uses when she's serious. I knew what this was about. I sat across from her, arms crossed. "What's up, Mom?" "Mark called me crying last night," she started. "He says they're getting evicted today if they don't pay. The kids are scared. Mike, I know what he did was wrong, really wrong. But are you really going to let your brother and your nephew and niece end up on the street?" "He brought it on himself, Mom," I said, trying not to raise my voice. "Did you see how he treated Emily? How they all laughed at her? I'm not giving money to someone who hurts my daughter." She sighed and ran a hand over her face. "I saw it, son, and it broke my heart to see my granddaughter like that. Mark's a fool. He always has been. But Ethan and Olivia, they didn't choose their dad, and now they're paying for him." Her words hit me hard. I thought about my nephew and niece again, their faces laughing, but also how they were just kids caught in Mark's mistakes. My mom kept talking. "Your dad, I don't have much, you know that. We can't help them with everything they need. But you've always been the strong one, Mike. The one who keeps the family together. That's why I'm asking you to think about it. Not for Mark, but for the kids." I stayed quiet, staring at the rolls in the bag. I hated that she had a point. But before I could answer, Emily came out of her room and greeted my mom with a shy smile. Mrs. Mary hugged her and said, "You're looking so pretty, sweetheart. How are you?" "Good, Grandma," Emily said, but her voice was soft. My mom looked at me, like she was saying, "See what's at stake." When she left, I was left with a knot in my stomach. I didn't want to give in, didn't want to give Mark anything after what he did. But the thought of my nephew and niece without a roof over their heads weighed on me. That night, while Emily slept, I sat in the living room with a beer. I thought about everything, the money I'd spent on Mark over the years, how he never really thanked me, how he used my savings to buy those expensive consoles while I worked my tail off. And then I thought about Emily, crying in her bed because of him. The scales weren't balanced. On January 13th, Mark called again from another number. I didn't answer, but he left a voicemail. I listened to it with the volume low, so I wouldn't wake Emily. Mike, they kicked us out. We're in a cheap motel with the little we could take. The kids keep asking what's going on. I'm begging you, brother, help me. Not for me, for them. I don't know what else to do. I turned off the phone and sat in silence. I felt a pang of something, maybe pity or regret, but I pushed it down fast. Mark had dug his own hole. I wasn't going to pull him out. Days passed, and things got weirder. On January 15th, my dad, Mr. John, came to see me. He doesn't leave the house much because of his bad knees, so I knew it was serious. He sat in the kitchen and got straight to the point. Mark's asking your mom and me for money, he said. He told us if we don't help, he'll sell the kids' consoles to pay for the motel. He's desperate, Mike, and we don't have anything to give him. And what do you want me to do, Dad? I asked, crossing my arms. Give him everything again? After what he did to Emily? I'm not saying forgive him, he replied, looking me in the eye. What he did was a disgrace. But those kids, they're your blood too. I'm not saying pay for everything, but isn't there something you can do? I thought about it. My dad doesn't ask for favors lightly. And though I was still furious with Mark, his words made me doubt more. That night, I talked to Emily. I told her everything, no sugarcoating, that Mark and his family were in a motel, that the kids didn't have school, that my parents were worried. She listened quietly, playing with a pencil in her hand. When I finished, she looked at me and said, Dad, I don't want you to be sad because of me. If you want to help Ethan and Olivia, it's okay, but don't let them laugh at me again. Her words hit me hard. My little girl, only 11, was being bigger than me. I promised her I wouldn't let Mark hurt her again. But now I had a decision to make, and I didn't know what was right. A few days passed, and Emily was back to drawing in the living room, humming a song she liked. I was splitting my days between the hospital and taking care of her, trying not to think too much about Mark and his family. I didn't want to help Mark, that was clear, but I couldn't get Ethan and Olivia out of my head. And then there was Emily, who told me not to be sad for her. My girl was stronger than I deserved. That morning, my mom called. Her voice sounded tired but firm. Mike, your dad, I talked to Mark last night, she said. We told him there's room here at the house for Ethan and Olivia, but not for everyone. The back room's been empty since you moved out, and we can fix it up for the kids. But Mark and Sarah will have to figure things out on their own. I stayed quiet for a moment, processing what she said. So the kids are going with you? I asked. Yes, son. We can't leave them in that motel. They're coughing and not eating right. But Mark needs to grow up for once. He can't depend on anyone anymore. I felt a strange relief. My nephew and niece would be okay with my parents, and Mark would have to face the consequences alone. I told my mom it sounded like a good plan, but that I didn't want anything to do with Mark. She sighed and said, I understand, Mike. This isn't easy for anyone. That same afternoon, my parents went to the motel and picked up Ethan and Olivia. Mark and Sarah stayed there, with their few belongings and no more options. I heard from my dad that Mark tried to convince them to let the whole family stay, but Mr. John was firm, only the kids. In the end, Mark had no choice but to agree. The next day, after thinking about it for a long time, I decided to start paying for my nephew and niece's school again. I came to the conclusion that by being around Mark, their father, they'd gotten used to acting like him, mocking everyone without compassion, so I decided to give them another chance. That afternoon, someone knocked on the door. I opened it, and there were my parents with Ethan and Olivia. The kids had their heads down, like they didn't want to look at me. My mom gave me a pat on the shoulder and said, We came because they have something to say. I let them in, though I wasn't sure I wanted to hear it. Emily came out of her room, curious, and stood close to me. Ethan spoke first, his voice shaky. Uncle Mike, we wanted to apologize. To you too, Emily, he said, finally looking at her. What happened at Christmas was wrong. Really wrong. Olivia nodded, fidgeting with her hands. We didn't mean to make you feel like that, Emily. It was Dad. He told us he was giving you that gift, the test thing, and that we had a laugh when you opened it. He said it was a game, that it'd make you feel less. But it wasn't okay. Ethan continued. Dad always told us making fun of people was normal. He laughed at everyone, at Mom, at the neighbors, even at us sometimes. He got us used to it. But after what happened, when we ended up in the motel and everything got bad, we realized we don't want to be like him. Emily looked at me, like she was waiting for me to say something. I was surprised. I'd always seen them as Mark's spoiled kids, but now they seemed genuine. I took a deep breath and said, "Well, you did hurt a lot. Not just Emily, but me too. But if you're really sorry, I want to hear what she thinks." Emily stepped closer and spoke softly. "It was really bad what happened. I cried a lot that night. But if you mean it, that you're sorry, then it's okay. I don't want to be mad forever." Olivia's eyes filled with tears, and Ethan swallowed hard. "Thanks, Emily," he said. "We promise it won't happen again." My dad, who'd been quiet, cleared his throat and said, "These two have been thinking a lot since they came to stay with us. They wanted to come see you for days, but I told them to wait until they were sure of what they'd say." My mom smiled and added, "They're good kids, Mike. They just needed to get away from Mark to see it clearly." After that, I invited them to stay for a bit. It wasn't easy at first. There was an awkward silence while we sipped soda in the living room. But then Emily pulled out her drawings and showed them to Olivia and Ethan. They looked at them and told her they were cool, and soon they were talking about cartoons. While the kids hung out, my mom told me Mark had found a job. It was a lousy one, cleaning bathrooms at a gas station for a few bucks a day. It wasn't much, but it was enough to rent a tiny room in a rundown apartment, a place with damp walls and no windows. He and Sarah moved there, scraping by with the bare minimum. They had no electricity or decent furniture, just an old mattress and a stove that barely worked. Every time my mom told me about them, I thought the same thing. That's what Mark deserved for treating Emily the way he did. I didn't feel sorry for him. He'd brought it on himself. Weeks passed, and my relationship with my brother was broken for good. If I saw him on the street, I'd cross to the other side. I didn't want to hear about him, his excuses, or his miserable life in that damp room with Sarah. Let him live with what he'd sown. As for my nephew and niece, they became Emily's favorite cousins. Sometimes they played in the yard. Sometimes they watched movies on the old TV in the living room. Seeing them laugh together lifted a weight off my chest. Emily was becoming the happy kid she used to be, and Ethan and Olivia seemed different, free from their dad's shadow. One day, Emily gave me a drawing of all of us, her, me, Ethan, Olivia, and my parents sitting in the living room, smiling. She said, "This is my family now, Dad." I hugged her and told her she was right. Mark wasn't part of this anymore. The family that mattered was here in my house, in the kids' laughter and the quiet days we were starting to have. Last Christmas had broken something, sure, but it had also built something new. And that, in the end, was what mattered.
Subscribe for more daily stories.